What's up, everyone? I'm an MTG Theory Crafter, and we're here with episode 2 of our Tempo series. In this example, I'm going to take the examples, or use the examples that we saw last episode, and I'm going to use those to build an equation that can properly reflect what is happening in those situations. Now, if you're not very good with math, if you learn better by examples, you might want to skip to episode 3, where I'm going to actually use this equation with the examples from episode 1 to generate numbers for each situation so we can compare what's going on with those. But you can always come back to this episode if you want to see where the equation came from. In any case, let's just jump right in. So in order to build this equation, build the model, what we have to remember is kind of what we got to at the end of last episode, which is that we want to go, like the highest tempo feeling situations are when you go from a losing state where you're losing badly to a winning state where you're winning by a lot, and you do this using the least amount of mana. In effect, it is a ratio. Tempo is a ratio, and in math, that means that it's going to be a fraction. And so remember what we talked about is that what we're really looking at is the change in expected win turns. And you're going to compare that to the mana usage efficiency. So you are going to basically see how much change in the expected win turns per mana that you use is essentially what's happening with the equation. Just to remember, if we're going to build a model, an equation that spits out a number, we want that model to spit out very big numbers for the highest tempo plays. So throughout this whole presentation, I'm going to be kind of referring to ways in which this equation will give us big numbers for our high tempo example. And just in case you don't remember from math classes, if you have a fraction, the way to get the biggest number from this fraction is to have a very large number in the numerator in the top for the change in expected win turns, and a very low number for the mana usage efficiency. So you want to have a big effect on expected win turns, and you want to do so for the least amount of mana. That's what this equation is going to want to communicate. So let's start with that top value, the change in expected win turns. When we are going to look at that, we're essentially going to be comparing the win turns before and after a spell resolves. So we're looking at a change in the expected win turns, or a difference in the expected win turns before and after the spell. Mathematically, that means we have to subtract these things. And the way we do that is by taking the final state minus the initial state. Which means in our situation, we're going to take the expected win turns after a spell resolves, and we're going to subtract from that the expected win turns before a spell resolves. Now remember, this number is in the numerator, so we want this number to be very big. If that's the case, we need the first parentheses, the expected win turns after a spell resolves, to be very large, while technically the second parentheses should be negative to make this value the highest number possible. The next thing we want to do is, what exactly do we mean by expected win turns? Well, for the convenience of this presentation, what I'm going to do is I'm going to call your expected win turn the actual win turn, because that's when you win the game. A small number for this means that you're going to win very soon, right? So if you're going to win next turn, that's going to be a smaller number than if you were going to win 10 turns from now. And likewise, a large number means you're not going to win for a while. On the other hand, your opponent's win turn is something I'm going to call the loss turn, because when your opponent wins, you're obviously losing. So just that's the phrase we're going to use to talk about your opponent's expected win turn. And of course, just like before, a small number means that your opponent is going to win soon. You're going to lose soon, right? Or a large number means your opponent is not going to win for a while. And remember what we just said, the best examples of tempo are huge swings from losing badly to winning immediately. And we're going to be comparing those using subtraction. So let's look first at the situation after the spell resolves, right? After a spell resolves, we obviously want to be winning by a lot. We want that spell to help us win, and we want our opponent to be losing by a lot. So we're going to be subtracting the win-loss turns after the spell resolves, and we need to figure out in what order to do this in. Well, let's remember, after a spell resolves, we want the opponent to be losing, which means we need a big number for our loss turn, and we want to be winning, which means we want a small number for our win turn. And because we want this number to be as big as possible, when we subtract, we need to do big minus small, which means that we're going to be subtracting the loss turn after the spell resolves minus the win turn after the spell resolves. Well, we also need to look at what happens before the spell resolves. And if we remember, we said we wanted to be losing before the spell resolves and then be winning by a lot after the spell resolves. So if we're going to focus in on what's going on before the spell resolves, right? The opponent should be actually winning by a lot, and we should be losing in that situation. So we're going to be subtracting here again, and again, we need to figure out in what order. Well, let's do the analysis. Before the spell resolves, the opponent should be winning, right? So we want a small loss turn. We want that loss to be imminent. And we should be losing, so we need a number that's very large for our win turn. Since this number, we wanted it to be negative, we actually need to do subtract the small minus the big. And so in that case, the loss turn, which is small, is going to be minus the win turn, which is big in our case here. So what does that give us? It gives us our final equation here that I write in mathematical, using mathematical symbols, right? So after a spell resolves, that's this first part of the equation. We need to do the loss turn, your opponent's expected win turn, minus your win turn after that spell resolves. And then on this side of the equation, we have what's going on before the spell resolves. We want your opponent's loss turn, which is your opponent's win turn, minus your win turn. And this basically defines what's happening before a spell resolves and after a spell resolves, and we put everything together in order to make sure that when we plug in the numbers from the highest tempo plays, that this part of the equation is going to give us the biggest number possible. So let's again remember that we want to do all this using the least amount of mana. And in our original fraction that we talked about, the mana usage efficiency is in the denominator. And this denominator, since we want it to be the least amount of mana and we want this full fraction to give us the biggest number possible for the highest tempo plays, we want this denominator then to be very small for those high tempo plays. So let's zoom in on that and see what's going on there. Well, mana usage efficiency is essentially a comparison of your and your opponent's mana usage, right? We're looking at a ratio. We're comparing your mana usage to your opponent's mana usage. And of course, this is done by a fraction. So the bottom part of our original equation, the denominator of that fraction, is also going to be a fraction. And that is going to be your mana usage over your opponent's mana usage. We're comparing those two. Again, we want this entire thing to be small because it's at the bottom of our original equation. If we want this to be small, that means that your mana usage needs to be small, a small number, and your opponent's mana usage should be a large number. Well, what is mana usage? It's essentially what you would imagine. It is the ratio of the mana that you have used already on the spell over the total amount of mana that you have used. So that is how we define what mana usage is. And of course, you have to do this for both you and your opponent. You need to analyze that for you and your opponent. So for you, remember your mana usage we wanted your mana usage to be small in these high tempo situations, right? So the mana cost of your spells needs to be actually small compared to the total mana that you've used, which is essentially means you want to be casting a bunch of cheap spells, many of them, not just one cheap spell, but many cheap spells. So each spell is a small amount of mana compared to all the mana that you have used. On the contrary, when you look at this for your opponent's mana usage, you want that to actually be a large number, or a number technically that is as close to 1 as possible. So their mana cost of the spell that they cast should be the same amount as the total mana that they've used, which essentially means you have one big expensive spell. At the end of the day, when you put all this together, you have basically a fraction in a fraction within a fraction. So you have the mana cost and total mana of your spells on the top, and the mana cost and total mana of your opponents on the bottom. For ease of calculation, for showing this, I actually split this up into a division problem, because if we remember, that's what fractions do, they divide. So when I use the mathematical notation, even though technically I should be using all fractions, I am going to be splitting this up into two fractions that are being divided, just so it's a little bit easier to follow. But as we already said, this first fraction is the top part, which means that this m represents the mana cost of the spell we're looking at, and the bottom number is the total mana that you used. And likewise, the m prime here is the mana cost of your opponent's spell, and m prime of t is the total mana that your opponent has used. So when we put all that together, we actually come up with the tempo equation, with all of the different parts that we talked about in one equation. The top part, remember, is the expected win turns, and we want to see how much we can affect the expected win turns with the spell that we resolve. And the bottom is comparing the mana usage of that spell and everything that's interacting with it. And as a reminder, this first part of the equation is what happens after a spell resolves, and we're going to be taking the lost turn minus the win turn. And we're going to do the same thing before a spell resolves. We're going to be subtracting lost turn minus win turn. Both of these are going to give us numbers, and then we're going to subtract those numbers. On the bottom, we're going to take, again, like we just talked about, the mana cost of your spell divided by the total mana that you used. And then on this side, we're going to take the mana cost of your opponent's spell and the total mana that your opponent used. We're going to divide those numbers, get a value for each of them, and then divide them again to get the mana usage efficiency, which compares your mana usage to your opponent's mana usage. When we plug all of this in, we can get one number that fully describes how much tempo was generated by the spell over the course of however many turns or actions that were a part of this interaction. So that's it for this episode, which kind of shows how I put this equation together. I basically took that last example that we looked at in episode 1, and since that was the highest tempo play that I could imagine, I always was checking my equation off of that example to make sure that when I plug the numbers in for that example, that it was always producing the biggest number possible that I could have. In our next episode, we're going to take a look at all of the examples in episode 1 that we looked at, and we're going to be giving a number to all those and really analyzing how this equation shows us that the tempo is exactly what we would have imagined for each of those situations, relatively speaking at least. So please stay tuned for the next couple episodes, where after that we're going to take a look at how we can even use this example to help us become better Magic players. Look forward to seeing you in the next episode. Thanks for listening.